Everyone, a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined this webinar on monetization of public assets. I have to say that it's indeed a privilege and honor to be introducing this galaxy of speakers, introducing the kind of resources that we've managed to bring to the discussion here. But to begin with, I would like to again introduce to this audience a man who really needs no introduction, especially in the context of the kind of discussions that he has managed to generate and have so much participation on. It is my honor to request Mr. Vishwanathan, to the editor and publisher of Industrial Economist, to make a welcome address. He established this magazine in 1968, and you will see that he has a lovely backdrop, which literally, when he is on spotlight, you will see that it shows you the journey of IE. From the very first episodes, you'll see there Mr. Nedunjarian in the background, and then you'll see speakers from today's panel also. I think Mr. Seshasai is there, Dr. Aaluwalia is there in the last pictures. These are all stalwarts who have joined and stayed with IE on its wonderful journey of explaining industrial economics to the discerning population of this country. Mr. Vishwanathan has been, he's known to so many senior leaders in governments, both at state level and at the center. I really am not going to read the bio out because then I might just take way too much time. I just want to say that his contribution to this field of just building this store of knowledge is immense. And beyond all that, he continues to amaze some of us that follow him with his energy and his quest for knowledge and his quest to bring more and more topics into the public domain. Over to you, Mr. Vishwanathan.
Thank you, Meenakshi. A hearty welcome to all of you. I'm indeed grateful that we could all respond immediately to my request to focus on a topic that is gaining so much traction and that's also inviting a lot of interest. And I give a small backdrop of why we have been doing this. As Meenakshi said, we come on the field in 1968, since our 54th year. It's a small, specialized publication, not reaching very large numbers, but in a state which has been known and famous for its film leaders and also its social consciousness and all. We came along with the DMK moralists in 1968, and the evolution is in parallel. All the social changes we have indeed. We thought there is enough need for us to focus on development issues, on economic issues. And we have been trying to do this both through my journal and also by organizing such seminars, public lectures, and interaction sessions. I'm happy that all the participants today have been very kind in associating with us. Montag himself, along with Judge Aaluwalia, had graced our meetings a few occasions in the past. For 40 years, Seshasai has been so sustained to us in terms of conducting this. A few years ago, when we organized a seminar on special economic zones, Vinayak very readily deputed his next in line to participate in this day-long seminar in which about 20 policymakers participated. What is the scope for special economic zones? And Krishnan has been a family friend for years, and I draw a lot of inspiration visiting and disturbing him at his secretariat office oftentimes, and getting updated on the various fiscal and monetary issues. A hearty welcome to each one of you. I had the privilege of looking at economic issues for 50 long years from the ringside seat. This has given me an opportunity to look at the changes in the various spheres, and infrastructure has been one of the fascinating areas which interests me a lot. In the 50s and 60s, the time when I was evolving in the early 60s, when I came on the field, infrastructure expenditure was largely made by multilateral and bilateral lending. A lot of help came from ports from many countries abroad. I had the opportunity to interact with several of these at World Bank, IMF, KfW, ADB, as also with ECB, European Central Bank. And apart from interacting with policymakers like Montag for close to 40 years in Delhi and other areas. So what impressed me at that point of time was the ability, especially with brilliant IAS officers like Krishnan, to source monies for investments from across the globe on extremely favorable terms. In the 60s, I was closely following the public sector, the ascent of the public sector, the commanding heights it was trying to reach, covered dozens of projects of BHEL, trade, naval aviation corporation, the coal, ONGC, and all those projects. One thing impressed me was the ability of the administration to source funding from institutions spread across the globe. I tried the instance of the first and the difficult parts of such sourcing. I was looking at how Naval Electric Corporation was funded. And you remember, Tamil Nadu lacked many natural resources. A major resource for the state has been lignite. And they had the foresight, some brilliant leaders had the foresight to dig deep, more than 100 feet, remove the overburden, and produce lignite in large quantities to produce power. In fact, at Neyveli, but for Neyveli, the northern parts and the central parts of the city of Untitled got so much of electricity for the development of agriculture and other areas. An interesting aspect here that struck me was the course of the funding for this. Initially, the German KfW loaned 100 million Deutsche Mark and with very easy terms, 10-year moratorium, 40-year repayment, and three-fourths of 1% interest. You could ask for more. The interesting part was this was used for producing power, essentially. And we started at a time when the Deutsche Mark was 1 rupee 30 paise. That means the 1 million Deutsche Mark was equal to 1300 million rupees or 130 crore. We were very prompt in making repayments after the 10-year moratorium ended in 70. We have been regular in this. By early 1990s, we had already repaid half the loan. That is 500 million Deutsche Mark had been repaid. But the balance 500 million mark, in terms of rupees, was a humongous amount because the Deutsche Mark has strengthened from 1 rupee 30 paise to close to 25 rupees. That means after repaying half the loan, the money due in terms of rupees built into something like 12,500 million rupees or 1,250 crore or nearly 10 times the original loan we took in terms of rupees. So I was wondering the problem of taking loans for activities that are not generating foreign exchange, for say water development projects or sewage development projects and things like that. So this was worrying me in terms of somebody looking at it. We thought the huge loans we are taking in terms of dollar, in terms of pound sterling, in terms of yen, they've all been bloating in terms of inability to control our exchange value. You fast forward, come to the 90s, we had the experiment of L&T, it was pioneered by Ramakrishna of L&T Faith. He constructed a road connection between Palghat and Coimbatore bypass. And there was the beginning of the concept of using a road infrastructure on long-term plan to repay it, to recover the cost in terms of tolls, and build the infrastructure in quick time. This gained traction in quick time, and then the Vajpayee we had the Golden Quadrilateral project that saw a spectacular transformation of the road system in the last 20 years. Is it sustainable? Luckily for us, in the 2004 to 2012, the economy grew rapidly, and we could take up more projects on the government sector too. But by and large, the BOT concept gained traction in terms of airports and things like this. We were thinking in terms of such a concept of involving private sector to do this. But today we have reached a stage where governments are in serious problems of raising resources. Krishnan is anyway going to talk about this later. So we had the problem of both center and the state struggling to raise resources exclusively for large projects. In that context, I felt this concept of monetization of public assets can assume importance. The point that is often posed by the parties in opposition related to the selling of the family's millers, but if carefully captured, this can be a game changer in terms of expediting construction. People like Vinayak, they are going to talk about the huge need for infrastructure spending. We talk in terms of hundreds of billions of dollars of money needed for this. One method of doing this, we ran a questionnaire on this a couple of months back. Montag and another expert on this from Tamil Nadu cadre YS, MS Singh responded to this. And luckily, both of them welcomed this, but they have the caveats and what are the things to be done to make sure that this works. This is safeguarding the public interest and all. My discussions with Shesh also geared onto this. We got special inputs on this. Then I thought why we should not get a public focus on this, as Montag suggested in its response to our questionnaire. An experiment of 5 projects or so can be taken for public discussion. The nuances can be finalized, and then we can launch on this. So I thought this subject, with the participation experts like you, can throw a lot of light on the modalities that need to be done, and also on the best manner of getting the best benefits out of the entire scheme. I thought your expert views will be of value to it. We will consolidate and present it in our issue and take it to the policymakers so that we could do this. I hand this back to Meenakshi to continue. I once again extend a very hearty welcome to each one of you and look forward to a treat from each one of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for those welcoming remarks, Mr. Vishwanathan. Indeed, it is my pleasure and privilege to now introduce our speakers. And Mr. Seshasai, with your permission, I'm going to introduce our speakers and introduce you and allow you to just take it as the flow, as a sutradhar, so to speak. I don't want to jump in every time with an introduction of the speaker. So if you will permit me, I will just introduce all our speakers together. Is that okay?
Absolutely okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So my pleasure to introduce our first expert on this panel, Dr. Montag Singh Aaluwalia, a very distinguished and decorated economist, civil servant, and former deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, Government of India. He has held several advisory positions in the Indian government and has been a key figure in India's economic reforms since the mid-1980s. He began his career at World Bank and joined the Indian Ministry of Finance in 1979, subsequently served as Special Secretary to the Prime Minister, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, as Commerce Secretary, Finance Secretary, member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. Many, many honors. Thank you, sir, for joining us. He currently is he's on the governing council of the Global Green Growth Institute based in South Korea, and is also distinguished visiting professor at the Stern School of Business at New York University. Welcome, Dr. Aaluwalia. Mr. Krishnan, IAS, thank you very much for joining us, sir. He's Additional Chief Secretary Finance, Government of Tamil Nadu. Mr. Krishnan belongs to the 1989 batch of the Indian Administrative Service, is currently the Additional Chief Secretary Finance, and also holds full additional charge as the Managing Director of New Tirupur Area Development Corporation. He has served as Senior Advisor in the Office of the Executive Director for India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Bhutan of the International Monetary Fund. He represented and assisted the Government of India in the G20 expert groups on international financial architecture and global financial safety nets. Through his multiple roles as a public administrator, Mr. Krishnan has demonstrated expertise in aspects of policy making, public finance, and socio-economic development issues. Thank you for joining us. Welcome, Mr. Krishnan. Mr. Vinayak Chatterjee co-founded Feedback Infra, India's leading provider of professional and technical services in the infrastructure sector since 1990. And he's only just recently stepped down from his executive responsibilities as chairman of this entity. He has been playing a strategic advisory role to leading domestic and international corporates, Government of India, various ministries dealing with infrastructure, as well as multilateral and bilateral institutions. Mr. Chatterjee is one of the leading proponents of the public-private partnership model for developing India's infrastructure. A well-known infrastructure expert, he's currently the chairman of the Confederation of Indian Industries Infrastructure Council. He was selected among the 100 global leaders of tomorrow at Davos. Distinguished alumnus of IIM Ahmedabad, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Welcome, Mr. Chatterjee. And to play the very important role of the Sutradhar, we have with us Chennai's very own Mr. R. Seshasai, very well known to most of us, but still I must introduce him. And a distinguished career at Ashok Leyland, culminating as now the vice chairman of the Hinduja Group. He has also served on many boards, including as chairman of IndusInd Bank, chairman of Infosys, now on the boards of Asian Paints, ICICI Bank, NIT Tiruchirappalli. He was the president of CII too during 2006-07 and president of Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers 2001-03. He's also very well known to us Chennaiites on many cultural and non-profit institution heads. He's associated with the Music Academy, with Cancer Institute, with the Schizophrenia Research Institute, truly multifaceted personality and a very well-known speaker on economic issues. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Seshasai. I know Mr. Vishwanathan is very anxious for you to kick off this discussion. So with no further ado, it's over to you.
Thank you, Meenakshi. And Vishwanathan, the task that you have given me is a very simple task, which is to raise questions and not answer, which I love, because firstly, I don't know the answers, and it's much easier raising questions than answering them. And in any case, you've got a very distinguished panel of people who know all the answers. So therefore, I'm going to confine myself to just raising a few questions. Firstly, while this asset monetization program or asset monetization pipeline, the AMP as it is called now, is something that has become very exciting and is being talked about widely now, we just have to remind ourselves that this is something which has gone on for many years. But we live in an age of brands. Whether it's the humble atta or a doormat, we need to have brands. And I love brands even for government programs. Even if it means that you have to, when you dig a hole, it's a hole digging yojana, and you fill up a hole, it's a filling up the whole yojana. It's worthwhile doing that because it most certainly focuses attention. It certainly catalyzes action. And, we've not had this webinar on asset monetization if it had not been branded and, promoted. And certainly it is a worthwhile exercise to brand it. And therefore, I endorse this, the trust that's being given by aggregating a lot of things which have been happening in the past as well. But since it is a brand, I thought I will deal with what the brand promise is about, what the brand salience is about, and raise some questions about what the salience means and what is it that we need to deliver this brand promise. So, if I take this, the banner name, asset monetization pipeline or program or whatever. In these three words, I think there are implicit assumptions and some brand salience issues. So let me start from the rear and then go to the forward. If you look at the pipeline, that is a very good signal that it is not a one-off thing that's being attempted, but it is a continuing process that's going to happen. That this is not something that is being looked at only from the point of view of fiscal management in the current context, the current challenges that we're facing in the area of in the era of COVID, but it seems to signal to me that this could be an ongoing program. We are building up pipelines. Now that raises two questions. One is that what sort of pipeline should this be? Of course, the government have indicated the kind of assets that are going to be put on this pipeline, starting from roads and power transmission and warehouses and airports and so on. But is there a philosophy that we need to adhere to in terms of putting up these assets? Would we put, for example, assets which cater to public goods and public services, or is it more those who have commercial viability, commercial interests, and cater to commercial interests? What kind of pipeline are we going to build? And is this, in this process of building up this pipeline, do we also have a larger agenda? Do we need to build large entities, private entities, which have the expertise in a particular area? For example, we look at airports. Are we going to be looking at companies which will have the expertise of managing multiple airports across the country and across the world? Because eventually that capability that you build inside the country could also be used for marketing yourself in the world outside. And therefore, do we have a larger agenda? Should we have a larger agenda to build organization with heft and expertise in a particular area? On the contrary, if we start doing that, are we likely to slip into the trap of building monopolistic organizations? Can we ensure that there is enough competition and yet enough critical mass of ability and expertise in the building these operations? So what kind of pipeline and what kind of a process of bidding that we need with an outcome that is going to take this forward, not merely just having an asset which is taken up for the purpose of earning an annuity, but using that as the nucleus for building an enterprise which is capable of competing not merely in India, but globally, and bring efficiency and the productivity into these assets. I think so. I think there needs to be perhaps a certain direction, a certain framework within which this pipeline has to be built. And therefore, I'll put that as the first question. What kind of framework should we have? And then I'll move to the middle word, which is the monetization. Now, that might well be an euphemism for privatization, although that we might say that we're not handing over the assets because of the potential kind of risk of emotions dealing with family silver and all of that. But in essence, we are really saying, the government is signaling that they believe that a private management will bring about greater efficiency and productivity. And that, I think, is a good signal to get from the government, that they believe that the private enterprise is a superior vehicle for bringing about greater degree of efficiency and productivity than a government-owned enterprise. And if that is the assumption, then it raises the question, in what manner are we going to ensure that the final brand promise of efficiency and productivity, and therefore reflecting in the user charge and the quality of services being rendered, is going to be significantly higher than what is currently available? Now, we have seen two models. We have seen models where the bids are received on the basis of the user charge, the most competitive user charge, which we have also seen has resulted in companies or corporations getting into serious financial challenges, resulting in holes being burnt in the balance sheet of banks eventually. We've also seen very efficient delivery of services and the softening of rates as a result of private enterprise coming into it. The power transmission is a classic case which has happened. On the contrary, in the first case, where we have seen the user charge being the lowest user charge being the basis for or criteria for selection, resulting in a very high degree of NPAs ranging from renewable power to the road building and so on. So what would be the right kind of balance? How do we make sure that when the process of selection is over and the evaluation has been done and then the asset has been delivered, how do we make sure that the productivity and the efficiency of that asset results in a lower price, a lower user charge, or a higher service capability, and the ability to expand? So I think that's the second question relating to this issue of privatization or monetization. And then you come to the third part, which is relating to the asset. And the asset might mean an innocent word in denoting that it is about brownfield assets being put up for monetization. Should this therefore only be confined to the brownfield assets which are currently being held by the government? Of course, there is a very large portfolio of such assets, and we can go on for several years trying to monetize the existing assets that the government holds on its balance sheet. But is that what we want to be doing? And if that is what we want to be doing, we are most likely to be attracting the kind of investors who would be content to have annuities, not necessarily the ability or the enterprise to develop beyond that. Or do we want to use this as an instrument for stoking enterprise, for incentivizing further asset creation? For example, if you make a brownfield asset of a road, if that is proposed for monetization, can that tag along with that also real estate development alongside? Can there be a township which can be developed by linking a few roads together, a few power stations together, fill up the gaps, and then the township comes into being because the enterprise that is necessary to connect all these dots, bring them all together, can be then promoted in that fashion? Is therefore the right kind of target being set by merely saying that this is going to be a brownfield asset? Or should the brand itself be different in order to say that we are using this as a nucleus? The asset is a nucleus around which we want to develop enterprise so as to have the incentive for a new entrepreneur to come in and create new assets, and not merely monetize an existing asset and pay an annuity and make that more productive, but create more assets. So in what form should this be framed? I think these are the questions which, to my mind, need to be thought through when we launch on a program which is seen to be a program for the future, which is seen to be a program that not merely addresses a few standalone assets, but all being pulled together to form a grand vision for the purpose of contributing significantly more to enterprise and economic development. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Whom are you posing the question?
Should we request Dr. Aaluwalia to first take the floor and respond or pose fresh questions, answers? Dr. Aaluwalia?
Well, thank you, Meenakshi. Can I be heard? Am I muted or no?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Well, first of all, I want to just endorse what Meenakshi said earlier by way of praise of Mr. Vishwanathan. I've known him for a very, very long time, and I'm aware that he's really made some major contributions in institutionalizing the process whereby economic issues can get discussed. I think he's read not just in Tamil Nadu, but in other parts of the country. So many congratulations. Delighted to be part of this program. Now, I think Mr. Shesasai has probably more experience in these matters than most of us put together. And so therefore not surprising that he's raised a number of very pointed questions. I'm not going to offer to answer all of them. I just want to make a few disconnected comments, and then whoever's being the Sutradhar can pick up bits and pieces from my contribution. First of all, I mean, I agree with what he said that, what's new? because as in all countries, rebranding and all this takes place. So I want to say that, you know, things don't have to be new. I mean, there's a lot of merit in continuity. And if we need to rebrand, good. I mean, if you think that's politically helpful, I have no problem. So what's in it that's continuous? What is continuous, I think, for the last several decades, not several, certainly for 2 decades, is the focus on infrastructure development as a key contribution of the government to the development of the country. And really, the government doesn't need to be there, in my view, in the production of many, many commodities, particularly where the private sector can do just as good at all. Unfortunately, the government is in all kinds of things, less than it used to be, but it should be much less than it is. However, everybody would agree that the government, the infrastructure development that this country needs has been underestimated. And therefore the government must take on itself, it's kind of an old-fashioned planning exercise, the planning of the transport, energy, urban infrastructure. I mean, if this country is to develop rapidly, somebody must be doing that. I don't mean planning in the old-fashioned sense of the government deciding everything, but conceptualizing how it's going to be done. Now, from that point of view, we actually have 2 separate brands here. One is the National Infrastructure Pipeline, and the other is the Monetization of Assets Pipeline. But the Infrastructure Pipeline sort of says, look, this is what we need in all these different sectors. They've given a whole lot of detail over the next 4 or 5 years, and this is the amount of money. And actually, what it comes down to is not very different from what we were saying even in the 11th and 12th plan. And Vinayak was a very close observer of what we were either doing or not doing, and he'll bear me out. But when it came to the slogans, we always said we need 2 percentage points of GDP more in infrastructure. We did get a bit of an increase, then things tailed off. Well, the present pipeline says give more or less the same number. We need an increase of 2 percentage points of GDP in that whole set of things called infrastructure. I completely agree with that. And I mean, I won't go into the details of whether this or that is more important, but that's certainly a national plan. And certainly on the energy side, on the transport side, on the urban infrastructure side, and to some extent also on health and education. Although there, I think it's less a question of money and more a question of how you deliver. And that aspect is not going to be dealt with here. But there is a national infrastructure pipeline. This is good. Now, the question is, how is it going to be built? And this raises 2 or 3 questions. Question number 1, is it all going to be built in a pure public sector mode? For many years, we have been saying that that's not feasible. I think the present government also takes the same view. And therefore, we need to have some bits which are really in the form of public-private partnership, where you bring in the private sector and find some way of getting them to take on the burden of the creation of new infrastructure. I think this addresses Mr. Seshasai's point that you must distinguish between brown investment and green. So that's clearly one. But even in the green, you can have in certain areas pure private investment, where you just open it up, and if the tariffs are good enough, the people will come. You can have a system where they need some support. So, I mean, in the old days, we used to have some kind of, the government will provide 30% or some such thing of the capital cost from the government, and the rest is up to the private sector to mobilize. And of course, you can also have pure public sector provision. And I think for certain infrastructure, it will have to be pure public sector provision. For example, a lot of the health infrastructure needed in rural areas is not really going to come from the private sector. A little bit here and there, you may get some private investment, but by and large, it'll have to be built by the public sector. And certainly roads, rural areas, remote areas, those are not areas where you're going to get private sector. But a very large part of the infrastructure requirements of growth can now come from people who perceive that there is a tariff structure in which they can make money. And by the way, getting people used to the fact that you have to pay tolls for roads was a very, very major improvement over the last 2 or 3 decades. Now, of course, it's become much better because you don't even pay. You just have a little smart card on your car and just go through. But you know, at the first time, I remember, and Vinayak will also remember this, that when people sort of said, look, who pays for traveling on roads? It's your job to build roads. Well, it's your job to build roads if you pay taxes in order to get them built, but it's much better to build roads where people pay for the road. And I think that is a conversion of attitudes that has taken place. So given that, what is the national infrastructure, the monetization pipeline? The monetization pipeline is just picking a whole lot of existing projects, which you can call brownfield, or actually they're more than brownfield, they're functional, and say, look, why not sell these things off to collect the money for infrastructure? That's the other thing that's new. In the old days, disinvestment was a part of the government budget, but the government budget was subject to planning. So there was some process which said we're going to get money from these sources, and this is how we're going to spend it. So maybe you could think that the national planning process would ensure that enough infrastructure investment actually took place. We've abolished planning, but this is quite a useful way of saying, look, whatever we raise from here is not going to go into paying subsidies and paying for the government's expenditure. It's going to go into building new infrastructure. So that is a different modality, and it's not a modality that's necessary if you have a strong planning process, because the planning process will do it. But in the absence of a planning process, it's a way of generating resources which can only be used to finance infrastructure. Now the question arises, what are the problems? I mean, and to my mind, by the way, I mean, increasing investment in infrastructure by 2 percentage points of GDP is not a trivial task by any means, especially since if you look at a medium-term perspective, we have to increase expenditure in many areas. Certainly we have to increase expenditure in defense. We have to increase expenditure in R&D, particularly with climate change around the corner. We have to increase expenditure in many of the areas like health and education, where the expenditure is not going to be on capital assets. It's really going to be on providing what used to be called non-planned expenditure, people delivering services. So there's a big demand for increased expenditure. And at the same time, there's an agreement that, you know, our fiscal deficit is too high. Now we can get away with it for a little while, and fortunately we have. But sooner or later, people are going to judge countries by whether they're bringing it down under control. I'm not, by the way, greatly in favor of them bringing it down this year. In fact, I've been saying that at a time when the economy is actually relatively depressed, there's no harm in having the fiscal deficit exceed the limits. But over the next 2-3 years, and this pipeline project is for the period up to 2025. So over this period, no question that the fiscal deficit will have to be reduced. So if we're going to increase expenditure and reduce the fiscal deficit, you know, there's quite a big turnaround that's needed. And how to finance infrastructure? Well, the monetization of existing assets, to my mind, provides a useful source of revenue. So this is one part which I hope the public understand. You know, a lot of people criticize by saying that this is just selling the family silver. It may be true, but what you're doing is you're selling the family silver to buy some more silver. So if you're using the realization of existing assets to create more assets or help the private sector to create more assets, then you're not actually selling the family silver in order to have a wedding celebration. You're selling the family silver to buy some other jewelry. So the public assets are there in a different form. So I'm not too worried about that. I think this now brings us to the question which Mr. Seshadri raised, that underlying all this, is there also the belief that the private sector would be more efficient? Now, you know, in my view, clearly there should be such a belief. governments don't like admitting that, because if a government says that, any number of people will jump up and say, you're anti-public sector. Then they'll say, what's wrong with the public sector? The human resources in the public sector are first class, which, by the way, I agree with. I mean, if you were opening a bank today or a steel mill or something, probably your best source of resources would be from the existing public sector operations, which have got a lot of skilled resources. The problem in the public sector is the totality of the governance structure just does not lend itself to efficiency. Now, this is a subject for a completely separate seminar, so I'm not going to go into that, but I happen to think that's true. It may not be true in every case, and a lot has depended in the past on the personal relationship between the head of the organization and the political support that he got. I mean, Krishnamurti, for example, was a hugely successful public sector manager, but he had political backing from the Prime Minister's office at the time, both Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi. So he could literally ignore the industry minister. And in his own biography, autobiography, he says so. When Maruti was being set up, if he had succumbed to what the then industry minister wanted, we would not have had Maruti. We'd have had some lousy second-rate European car, and we would not have had an automobile revolution. So I'm not saying that the public sector doesn't have skilled people, but I think our governance system makes it the exception that such people are actually allowed to manage. So this is a subject for a different seminar. Many of your readers will say this reflects a bias on my part. I don't think it reflects a bias. It reflects a careful judgment. Now, I may be wrong, but I'm not mechanically saying the public sector. I wouldn't say, for example, that the private sector is best in everything. And certainly, for example, in health, there are real issues there where the private sector can get driven into a different direction, where maybe that's one area where we should not vacate entirely to the private sector. We need some standard setting by having some first-class public sector hospitals also in place. So answer to Sheshasai, yes, implicit in this is the assumption that the private sector will manage better. So then what are the problems? Well, I think the problems are really two or three that I can think of, and Vinayak has a lot of experience on this, and he also has a lot of experience on my views, because we've discussed this often. I think whatever you do, you have to make sure that the means in which you're bringing in the private sector has to be transparent. Because when you bring in the private sector into infrastructure, it's not the same thing as privatizing Maruti. I mean, if you privatize Maruti, you're telling Maruti that, look, we're also allowing a lot of other fellows to compete. Now you do what you like. Big car, small car, middle car, we're not bothered. You just have to succeed. That's not what you do with infrastructure, because you're actually controlling the rates that they can charge. And there are other constraints also. I mean, for example, the current dispute that's going on with, let's say, one of our private sector ports, banning things coming from one or two countries. I mean, I think that that's wrong. Governments have a right to ban imports from a particular country or a group of countries. But if the government exercises that sovereign right, that's fine. But I think if you have a port, I don't think the port authorities should be able to deny ships coming from a particular country. Now that's an issue which we can have a discussion on. But you need to be very clear, what are the rules on which you're being allowed to operate this particular enterprise? That's one. The second is that, you know, within that, there has to be competitive bidding. Now, this will run into all the usual problems about, you know, cronyism and this and that. You gave it away to your friends kind of thing. Now, the truth is that if you have transparent systems of bidding and genuine competitive bidding, then you are actually giving it to the person who paid the most. You can add something to that by having a reasonable minimum bid. So you don't give away something for 2 rupees. But once that is done, then there should be an understanding that there won't be a subsequent complaint that cronyism has operated. Otherwise, the whole thing won't work. And I think it's possible to do that. The third problem with this, and this is a real tough one, and it applies to all private sector in infrastructure. You know, when you hand over an infrastructure facility to someone, you hand it over on certain terms that are laid out and specified. And this was the problem we ran into in UPA 1 and also in UPA 2. Because a lot of the private sector guys would say that, look, when we bid, we had this expectation, things have changed. And if things change, you know, how do you expect us to live by our original promise? Now, the short answer is if you're a competent buyer, a competent bidder and a businessman, these are risks that you work out. So you win some and you lose some. But they said that, look, that's perfectly okay over a 3, 4, 5-year horizon. I should have anticipated. But if I've got a contract for 30 years or 40 years, then quite honestly, I can't anticipate what situation will arise 10 years from now. And their feeling was that the government is not a partner. In fact, many businessmen told me, you know, sir, this use of the term public-private partnership is wrong because you choose us, but once we are chosen, we are not partners. We are actually captives. And whatever we come up with, even when you agree that the circumstances have changed, you are not in a position to change the terms of the agreement. And I think this is a serious problem because ultimately, when an officer has to make a decision, he is generally not going to be willing to give a concession to the private partner because he's going to assume that the private partner should absorb the loss. But actually, of course, what happens is that they can't absorb the loss, things get stuck, operations get delayed, and so on. Now, you can have a similar problem in a private sector company. And here, both Vinayak and Sheshasai can tell me. You can imagine a big private sector company enters into a contractual relationship with some supplier, and some unexpected thing happens. And the supplier persuades them that, look, if you force me to stick by the original terms of the contract, I'll just go broke. And you lose your supply chain, you'll have to find another supplier. Isn't it reasonable for you to change? And my guess is that in the private sector, they're willing to take that decision. In the public sector, you're not. And it's not the fault of the officer, because the officer will be held responsible. How come you helped this guy? And the implicit assumption is that if you had not conceded, they would have delivered, which of course is not the case. Now, to be honest with you, I don't know how to solve this problem. When I was in government, we recognized this. We said we must find ways of doing it. The government usually says we'll set up a committee in the same ministry, but that doesn't actually help. Maybe it has to be something outside the ministry. Maybe it has to be in the Prime Minister's office, whatever. But if we want to have serious exploration of the public-private partnership mode, and I think we have to, because I don't see any circumstances in which the government will be able to fund all this by itself, then we must find some way where this can be done. And that's why I personally feel that we should have a PPP law, you know, where, and we had proposed this, but we weren't able to get it done. We should have a PPP law so that all public-private partnerships come under the framework of the law, and then whatever is done is guided by the terms of the law. See, otherwise, you're being guided by general financial rules, and that's a disaster. No government servant will depart from the written word. But if you enshrine in a new public-private partnership law how you're going to handle these things, you will create a lot more willingness to be flexible. Well, I mean, I could go on and on, but I'm not going to do that. Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to hearing other people's comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Montag. I think this issue that you flagged, that we don't really have a private-public partnership, because partnership would imply that you take risks together in expectations of certain returns. And the government, given its structure, given its the framework of the government, the governance that it has, it's almost impossible for a government to take a commercial decision based on forecast returns and forecast risks. And that is the center point. But I believe there were some very useful suggestions which came out in Kelkar's report when he reviewed the earlier issues of failures on the PPP mode. It's not a complete solution, nor is law probably a complete solution. But it is moving towards that. I think you've got to make it as easy as possible, but not quite the right solution for getting an equitable kind of distribution of risk and return for both partners, particularly over a long horizon of time, 20, 30 years. But that's an important issue, but I don't think we have a ready answer for that. Maybe we should go to Krishnan.
Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much. I think it's a real honor to be part of this panel. Such eminent people. Mr. Montag Aaluwalia needs no introduction. I've had many occasions to interact with him when I was in Delhi and Washington, and always gained tremendously learning from him. Mr. Seshasai, of course, is in many ways the doyen of much of what goes on in Chennai across this real space of public and private partnership. Again, somebody I've known through over almost 3 decades. And I need to, Mr. Vinayak Chatterjee, though I've never met, but over the years have read and have seen outputs from Feedback Ventures and various other reports through my career. But most importantly, Mr. Vishwanathan, who of course was very kind to mention, is a family friend, but more than anything else, there's one memory of him which I will never forget. In Delhi in 2006 or 7, we had revived this practice of having the Economic Editors Conference. And, when you meet Delhi's media or Bombay's economic media, most of them write for Pink Papers or for one of the wire agencies or one of these TV channels which have 24-hour business news. And almost all of it is confined to stock markets and financial markets and discussions of that nature. And I recall this interaction where Mr. Vishwanathan raised a number of very pertinent issues with the finance minister. Suddenly we were brought back to reality that, it is from the periphery of the country that you really learn that what is important to farmers, what is important to small businesses, what is important to industry, and what becomes of a real investment, what the real sector of the economy really means, was brought home by that intervention of Mr. Vishwanathan. And I remember that very vividly. And that's something which has stayed with me for many years, that often we mistake various types of financial engineering for what really needs to happen. And in that context, and that's the context in which I would like to address the asset monetization program, which has been talked of and released. You see, fundamentally, Mr. Aaluwalia made this point that not all of it is new, and many of these things have been going on for many years. Even tolling of roads, it's a 19th century enactment, and we still apply that enactment. The Indian Tollways Act and the toll road provisions and so on. And these are very old provisions. They are more than almost 200 years old, and we've been using them over time, and many of them have stood the test of time. So it is not as if many of these ideas are brand new. These are things which can be done. The issue which really arises, and here I need to make this point. This is a public event, and I do represent government, and I need to make this point. Our chief minister has actually written to the prime minister on the asset management plan, and he has raised, in my view, also certain valid issues. And most of it centers around, do we consult stakeholders adequately? Do we talk to all partners who are involved in the process? I think very often, although I'm a finance secretary and very often issues relate to money, but where we fail is in the softer things. Where we fail is in the management. Where we fail is in communicating ideas so that everybody comes along with you and understands the intent, and that reduces, in a sense, the pressure with which we need to act, and the understanding amongst the general public. If the criticism today is that you're selling family silver, it is justified criticism because a number of people have not been taken on board in terms of what is really intended. And what the difficulty is that many ideas that state governments, many ideas that we want to implement, and we may not want to give it the same degree of publicity because you need to educate different segments of the population you deal with. We may not want to do it at one go, but then it sort of happens in bits and pieces and in ways that you do not you don't speak of publicly, but in terms of sheer improvement in the quality of service, you're able to deliver something significant. Let me give you one example. We spoke of hospitals and schools as one of the areas where improvements need to take place. In Tamil Nadu, for instance, in government hospitals, and government hospitals have been an eye-opener to me personally and to Mr. Vishwanathan himself. The services which are rendered for a variety of diagnostic services, even MRIs, PET scans, and a number of other things have been very innovatively managed. That through the Tamil Nadu Medical Services Corporation, you hire the equipment, the supplier of the equipment gets paid on a per-use basis. It is subsidized for those who really need the subsidy. The others pay as per their capacity. And you have a very efficient system which works. I mean, it is asset monetization of the kind that we intend. This is expensive equipment which is available, which normally is available only in private hospitals, but in this case is made available in a range of government hospitals, and people are getting access to it. There is a pay-per-use, there is some degree of subsidy from the government, but a very large portion of it, the O&M and everything else get covered in terms of payments. All of that takes place. The minute you try to brand this, the minute you try to make it into one big exercise, you cast a big aura of suspicion about the whole thing in terms of, are you trying to sell assets? When you are able to establish that quality of service is good and people are willing to pay for it, and people absorb it in a way without too much of opposition to it, then I think we've achieved a much bigger objective. So I think an important message in all of this is the need to respect a federal structure, need to respect that different parts of the country will find their own ways of implementing such ideas, need to not try and say that one plan will fit all of the country. I mean, you could manage it in different ways in different places. And I think that's an important thing which got lost out in the way that the entire plan has been put together. And what's, again, more interesting and again, troublesome is that we assume that it is actually when you privatize an asset or even when you monetize an asset, we assume very frequently that all of this has been done there are big beneficiaries. The central ministries have gained largely in this, and then it is the private sector has come in with money, and it's a win-win for everybody. One agency loses heavily, and that agency invariably is a state government. And the reason for that is many of the PSUs, central PSUs, the lands that they own were bought or given to them virtually free by state entities. Some years ago, I stayed in the Radisson Blu Resort in Mahabalipuram, not far from Chennai. And when you actually go and see the main building there, it actually says Madras State Government Guest House, inaugurated by K. Kamaraj, Chief Minister in 1954, right? I mean, it was a state government guest house, which was handed over to ITDC to run as a resort. and which was later privatized. And I'm sure all of that land belonged to the government of Tamil Nadu, and all in good faith, they hand over the land and somebody is making a pretty penny out of it. And when ITDC and many of the hotels were privatized, they took the money, which is when we woke up to this. Today, when you want to privatize Hindustan Photo Films, the issue is that the land was given virtually free by the government of Tamil Nadu. When you look at, Videsh Sanchar Nigam Limited having been privatized, you see, they have premises now. The private sector company has large premises which are in the middle of a government estate. That's fine. I mean, we don't have a problem, but we've never asked, we've never consulted. More importantly, even that, in a sense, is most of what is left is real estate. When Hindustan Teleprinters gets privatized, what is left is real estate. There's very little of any, very little of the original teleprinter business which carries on there. And somebody has had a free lunch at somebody else's expense, and somebody else has paid for it, and it's usually taxpayers of states who have ended up paying for it. Even to that, we don't have a problem. But the difficulty we have in the next round is that when it becomes, when we have land which relates to the railways or to the defense establishment, let us not forget that almost all the land that the defense establishment holds today is a colonial hangover. The largest defense cantonment in the country is in Secunderabad. And why? Because the Nizam of Hyderabad gave all that land to the British Army to protect him against Tipu Sultan and Hyder Ali. And that is that entire set of land that they now sit on and say, this is ours and you won't touch it and you take a little bit. There's a problem. I'm sitting right now, the office I'm sitting right now is in defense land, and we sit in cramped quarters simply because the rest of it lies unused in the hands of the defense ministry, and you want to touch it. You have to give them land of equivalent value somewhere for which they have no use. I don't think either in Secunderabad or in Hyderabad or in Chennai or even in Bangalore for that matter, any of this is of strategic importance at all. The reason I make this point is that it is a one-way relationship in a number of ways which many people ignore. And there is another set of people sitting at the table who have perhaps, compensated and who have lost out in this whole deal of monetization of assets. So we need to be conscious of this. The other element, and some elements of this are absolutely unexceptionable. We have to find non-debt creating instruments to raise resources. The fiscal deficits are certainly a problem, and tolling roads is the most logical way of doing it. And very often, for instance, the Tamil Nadu Transmission Company, TAN Transco, wherever they've laid their high tension lines for transmission of power, also have optic fiber cable all over the place. So clearly that's an asset which needs to be monetized very quickly. It can be monetized without selling. So there are many such intelligent ideas which can easily be done and which need to be addressed in a decentralized way, in a way that it works for each state, rather than in this big flashbang fashion, which then creates its own set of issues and sets people up against the idea, and then actually militates against efforts that you want to make when you want to monetize on a small scale. So now I can never call my tolling proposal within the government of Tamil Nadu part of an asset monetization plan, simply because you painted it in a particular color, and so we will have to call it something else to make sure that we raise the money that we need. The other element, and so there's one country, one business, one anything business is a serious issue that we need to allow for that. We need to allow for that kind of flexibility for states and agencies of that nature to act. Two other points I just quickly want to re-endorse. One, of course, is this whole difficult issue of contract renegotiation. Clearly, especially when we do contracts of this nature, they are 30-year contracts, 25-year contracts, long-term contracts. There is a serious issue of capacity, which should not be ignored. And capacity, unfortunately, I find it's not just lacking in the government system. Clearly, the government system has capacity issues. There are some good civil servants, there are some good officials at various levels, but we also carry a lot of passengers. But in addition to that, even when you hire consultants, my personal experience has been, except for a few, I think most consultancy firms don't give us the best consultants that they have to handle government contracts. I mean, whether this has been experienced over the years, and therefore there's clearly a capacity constraint of how much can be done. So we need to be realistic in terms of how much can be done and how quickly. And the other thing, when you're looking at urban infrastructure, I think what many people don't realize is that funding can be found, but because there is such large grant funding, whether originally in the form of JNNURM, which was introduced in the 2000s, or subsequently in the form of this Amrit and Smart Cities and other programs, the grant component is so large that is more than adequate to fill the capacity of a concern of a local body to actually implement. And therefore, they're not looking at innovative ways of raising more money to see how much more additional infrastructure they can provide. And Mr. Aaluwalia made that point very clearly, that we today do not provide adequate infrastructure, and the quality of infrastructure is not of the kind that is really needed. And our people, our citizens, certainly require enhanced quality of infrastructure. And for that, I think a critical issue which needs to be addressed is capacity.
Yes.
Then the last point that I would like to the last point that I'd like to make is this whole issue of contract renegotiation. As I started out from the capacity perspective, government structures often are not designed to look at contracts over, say, a 25 or 30-year period. The continuity which is needed to monitor, creating structures which understand and recognize, what the sanctity of a long-term contract is. And, how do you sort of legally answer those issues? How do you protect yourself before the auditors, the CNAG? How do you protect yourself when the same thing goes into a litigation? And, how do you sort of ensure that the whole thing gets taken care of through a litigation process? So I think managing long-term contracts well and effectively, and even when you need to renegotiate them intelligently, because I agree entirely, it's very difficult for us to foresee all the issues which may arise over a 30-year time span, and it might become completely unworkable at some point in time. So what would be the kind of triggers? I mean, can we now, based on the almost 15, 20 years of experience, structure these contracts in such a way that you understand what the triggers for renegotiation would be? At what stage would you pick it up and say that, okay, I need to think of this differently? All of those elements need to come in. And the last one is of organization culture. And I think organization culture, somebody had asked this question saying, does it automatically mean that the private sector is more efficient? Clearly, private sector has some advantages. It's more nimble. It can come in and out of sectors at various points in time. There's a way that you can exit. Governments have this unfortunate problem of exit. It's very difficult for government agencies to exit from certain responsibilities. And particularly in infrastructure, the way the whole thing is grounded is the sovereign responsibility of providing the service still rests with the government agency. And the private agency is really only a service provider. And if he fails, there's still a sovereign responsibility of the government to find an alternative to see that the service delivery is continued. So understanding the contract in these terms and trying to see whether there could be mechanisms where service delivery to the public continues, while at the same time you don't impose unacceptably high costs on the private sector. Because, I mean, if we are talking about creative destruction of capitalism, some private contractor doesn't judge a contract okay and deliberately underbids in order to win more contracts, and he thereafter suffers. I don't think he deserves protection. But equally, somebody else who's hit by a complete, a perfect storm needs protection of a different kind. So I think these are all factors which need to be worked and thought through, and these would be just some of the critical issues that I would. So just to conclude on that point of which is more efficient, I think it's much more dependent on the organizational culture. Some organizations are built in such a way in the public sector and in the private sector which can be efficient, and some organizations right from inception are built in a way that they're not efficient here or there. So that would be my a limited point on that aspect. So let me stop here. I hope I've addressed some of the issues and questions which got raised. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Krishnan. Always a pleasure listening to you. I think the two very critical issues that you raised, the one relating to the eroding space for the states as stakeholders, the abridgment of the autonomy of states. Nobody can give better response than Montag on this. So I will leave it finally to, when we finish this, to Montag to respond to that. And the second point that you raised about contract renegotiation, something which Montag also touched on, something which I think is very central to the resolution of this entire program and the success of this program. I think nobody better than Vinayak who can give the answer to that question, because I think he spent a lot of time thinking about it. I know that we have discussed this in the past, recall that, Vinayak. So over to you, Vinayak. You're muted.
Yeah, thank you, Sesh, and thank you, Mr. Vishwanathan, for a very stimulating session. I mean, it was a pleasure hearing Montag. It was a pleasure hearing Mr. Krishnan, and let me now add my 2 pennies to the conversation. You know, the national monetization pipeline as an economic strategy for the nation is very clearly an inevitability. It had to happen, whether you called it by any other name or any other label. For the simple reason that there are 3 forces at work simultaneously, which is leading in this direction. The first is, let us step back and understand the nature of infrastructure risk and investment. All infrastructure projects very simply fall into 3 buckets: development risk, construction risk, and operating risk. What we did in the early days of the PPP program was we addressed the hardest part. We offered greenfield projects in power sector, roads, in ports, and airports. We offered the hardest part, which included development, construction, and obviously it would lead on to the operation risk. What NMP does is it clearly recognizes that there is really very little confidence and appetite for private investors in the first 2 stages, which is development risk and construction risk. It recognizes that reality. And having recognized that reality, it then says, okay, guys, come into the area which is definitely less riskier, where development and construction risk has been removed. Here is an operating project. So let's monetize that. So it recognizes the reality that we are now asking private capital to come in at a last, less riskier stage. That's force number 1. Force number 2 is, as I mentioned, a serious diminution of appetite of Indian private sector as well as international private investors of the large infrastructure operating types have all left the country. And the large Indian corporates like L&T and others have vowed at their boards that we are not going to touch PPP again. Nor are bankers encouraging them, nor are the banks lending. And therefore, the appetite for greenfield infrastructure amongst investor community is practically not there. It's a complete erosion of confidence in the PPP format and PPP processes. So that's force number 2. And that reality has been recognized. The third recognition of reality is what is it that domestic and largely international capital. If you see the last few PPP projects, it is international capital that is coming in a big way. The Canadian Pension Fund, CPP, CPPIP, CDPQ, Swedish funds, Singaporeans, the Gulf, these are all either sovereign funds or insurance funds or pension funds. That is the class of capital that needs to come into infrastructure, which has that capital is patient capital, it is long-term capital, and is looking at annuity yields. What do we have to offer them? We have to offer them operating brownfield assets, which have demonstrated stable or semi-stable cash flows at least. So I am just outlining these 3 forces which are working at tandem. The erosion of confidence in the first 2 risks, development and construction, acceptance of the third bucket, which is operating risk, a complete loss of confidence from the Indian corporate sector, and from the operating infrastructure companies in putting more money into greenfield PPPs, and a reasonably large appetite, a very large appetite for operating assets, which is not only supported by standalone institutions, but are also supported by new instruments like InvITs and REITs. InvITs and REITs do not support greenfield investments. They support the offloading of operating infrastructure projects. You got these three forces at work. And what the National Monetization Pipeline does is I don't know whether anybody's thought through this at this level of structural detail, but what it effectively does in practice is that it recognizes these three ground realities and carves a scheme by saying, okay, we've got a stock of brownfield assets, the government needs money, and domestic and international capital love operating projects and annuity investment. So here we go. So in that sense, I think it's a virtuous cycle that has been established. Sell the brownfield assets and recycle the money into government itself, at least for the time being, till PPP is reset. Let the government structure the first two portions, development risk and construction risk, and operate through EPC companies. And so when EPC has delivered, probably a year or two after that, it is ready for monetization. So there is a correlation between NIP and NMP, which to my mind, if properly executed, leads to a virtuous cycle, and nobody in economics can doubt it. I now want to address the contentious issue of states that Mr. Krishnan raised. There is no question that there is a debate on cooperative federalism, competitive federalism, abandoned federalism. These are debates which are happening all the time, not just in the infrastructure space, but in the larger societal space. However, if you look at the detail of the NMP scheme, I was rather, shall I say, heartened to see that for once the central government actually has provided some windows of, shall I say, appreciation for the state's position in the NMP, whether it is privatizing state-owned utilities or central PSU, and I'll read it out to you. The incentives on states on NMP, if the states divest a PSU and raise funds, a PSU, the central government will give them 100% of that as financial assistance. It's there, I've noted this down, it's in the NMP scheme. If a state divests a PSU, the center will give them 100% of that amount as financial assistance. If not fully, it partly addresses the issue that Mr. Krishnan has raised. The second point is, if they monetize the asset, then government will give them 33% of the amount. And if states list a public company in the stock market and raise funds, the government will give them 50% of that amount. So while it may not completely address the issues of center-state federalism and bonhomie and cooperation, it recognizes the fact that if states make an effort, the central government will go out of its way to compensate them. And I think it's an important point that we should not miss in this debate. There is an attempt to incentivize states, if I may put it that way. The second important point is that I'm going to do some little bit of simple maths for you. Once you understand that the NIP and NMP are linked at the hip, the important point is how much PPP, how much private capital are we planning to raise? Now, very clearly, the NIP is 20 lakh crores per annum is the plan, 111 lakh crores for 5 years, roughly 20 lakh crores per annum, of which 30% is to come from private capital. So 30% of 20 lakh crores is 6 lakh crores, right? Now, so far as the NMP is concerned, it's a 4-year program of 6 lakh crores, 1.5 lakh crores, 100% of which is going to come from private capital. That's the whole idea. So 6 plus 1.5 is 7.5 lakh crores. So every year, now this is the point that Montag also made, we are stretching ourselves to a humongous level to attract domestic and foreign capital in the combination of these two projects. We are supposed to be raising 7.5 lakh crores, right? Now, the question is, therefore, how much have we done in the past? And I will read out the figures from you. Montag, I did some deep dive on your prodding me to find out about gross capital formation in infra. I will share with you later that I did find the figures in bar charts in the NIP pipeline detailed documents in the annexures. I will share that with you separately. I picked out the figures from there. Keep in mind that we require 7.5 lakh crores per annum for mobilizing private capital, domestic and foreign. In 2016, we did 3 lakh crores. In 17, we did 2.6 lakh crores. In 2018, we did 2.5 lakh crores. And in 2019, we've done 2.5 lakh crores. I would suspect that in this pandemic period, we probably have done less at around 2.0 lakh crores. The official figures are not out. Let's stay with the figure of 2.5 lakh crores. That's the maximum we have done in the last 3 years in mobilizing private capital for greenfield and brownfield for infra. And now you're saying we need to do 7.5, right? So we have to stretch ourselves to do 3 times more. in the current context of capital shortage, both in public expenditure as well as in private sector balance sheets, what is required is now I am going, the reason I said these figures is that it is a very, very large stretch target. And to achieve that, there is to be we have to reset PPP on a war footing. Now, the discussions on PPP can carry on till midnight, Mr. Vishwanathan, and I don't think your audience will like it. We panelists may love it. But I want to make two short points that unless PPP is completely reset on a war footing, you are not going to be able to mobilize 7.5 lakh crores when you're effectively doing 2 or 2.5. So what is required in PPP reset? One, you require the Kelkar committee report addresses most of the things that have been discussed about PPP. It was a very eminent, erudite, grounded committee that made a whole set of recommendations. I don't want to go over it because it touches on issues of independent regulation, renegotiation, protection of bureaucrats from arbitrary inquiries, even post-retirement, etc., etc., etc. It's got a laundry list of everything required to reset PPP. And if any of your delegates just downloads the executive summary on Google, you don't need me to waste further time on it. So point number one, just by the way, the Kelkar committee was set up by this government. It was not set up by the UPA government. By the time the government inherited in 2014, PPP had crashed for very good reasons, which we are learning now. But this government had set up the Kelkar committee report. So in a sense, this government has a moral obligation to, in a sense, address the recommendations and say which it appreciates, which it doesn't. But in some senses, it has chosen to ignore the report, which I find very difficult to digest. So the Kelkar committee has a long laundry list. It doesn't require one more seminar to discuss the ills of how to rectify PPP. It's done. Just read the report. Don't even read the report, read the executive summary. Point number two, this government, in the first budget speech of Mr. Jaitley in July 2014, set aside 500 crores to set up a PPP knowledge foundation called 3P India. Now, why did Mr. Jaitley do it? Because he was well advised by leading economists that if you do not have a knowledge, impartial, neutral, knowledge sharing, centralized institution to manage the PPP process, you are likely to go haywire, which is exactly the way we have gone. If you see the last two bids, the Indian Railways privatization bid attracted 113 very interested parties in the pre-bid conferences. When the bids opened, there were only two, IRCTC and Mega Engineering. What happened? The PPP formatting was all wrong. If you read today's newspapers, you'll realize that there have been 3,000 objections raised to the PPP format of BharatNet, which is the optic fiber linkage to the panchayats. So the problem, even in the national monetization plan, the problem that I see it is that there are 16 central ministries and you add some of the other appendages at the center. You add Ministry of Finance, NITI, PMO, and Law and Justice. You've got 20 organizations at the center. Now, the states are also supposed to monetize their assets. So let us even take the top 10 states and assume that there are 4 departments in the states, roads, housing, etc., that are going to privatize some assets. So 10 states into 4 departments in a state is 40 organizations, and there are 20 at the center. So 60 organizations are now going to hire consultants and apply there and tell all their IAS officers to say, please develop your own PPP format now. I mean, this is ridiculous. 60 organizations are going to rediscover what kind of a format they require for PPP, right? So the railways do their number, the roads and highways ministry do their number. In the state, the water department does its number, the urban ministry does its, urban department does its number. So everybody is free to do their number. And when the bidding happens, what happens is what we have seen in the Indian Railways bid, what we are seeing in the BharatNet bid, and we have seen across many, many bids that end up wasting time and effort and come to naught. There is no question that we need a central repository of knowledge that puts together, and there has to be some kind of a mandate to say that if you are PPPizing something, please pass it through the 3PR Institute, and they should act as some kind of a quality control, which we have in all the manufacturing centers in our country. We have R&D, we have quality control, and you don't leave everything to production. So we need a 3P India to harmonize the PPP movement over and above recommending the Kelkar committee, over and above implementing the Kelkar committee stuff. If we do not do soft stuff like this, then I'm afraid that this will just remain a plan on paper. First, the enormity of the target, and secondly, the absence of an institutional framework that accumulates knowledge and harmonizes the efforts. As I said, 60 different people are going to play their own tune. God help us. I'm actually going to stop to say there are two requirements. One, people have mentioned it before me, transparency. There is a widespread fear of crony capitalism in the award of infrastructure bids. I do not wish to say more. It is a clear and palpable fear. And that needs to be addressed by assuring the public at the state level, at the central level, across the country, that the bids are transparent and, like Caesar's wife, the processes are above suspicion. It needs to be done. It needs to be demonstrated. The second thing is ring fencing the proceeds from monetization. I am afraid the way that, we pay 400 rupees a ton for coal cess. It was meant to fund greenization of thermal power projects so that you put all the pollution equipment and reduce pollution. Do you know what the coal cess is used for? Everything else from cleaning the Ganga to reducing the fiscal deficit. So my worry is, and earlier it was done with the Central Road Fund also. There is a 100 rupee or whatever, not 100 rupee. There is a 1 rupee, 2 rupee cess on diesel and petrol, which is supposed to fund the roads. That also has been diverted for other purposes. So in the central government, I'm not talking about the states, we have a vast history across different governments of misusing funds that are meant to be ring-fenced and escrowed. So my fear again is, at the state level, at the central level, once an asset is monetized, as a citizen of the country, where do I get the assurance that it's going to be plowed back in infrastructure and not going to be used for any, splurging on unnecessary expenses? So I think the NMP needs to go one step further and announce to the public a methodology of ring fencing the proceeds so that the virtuous cycle is built and doesn't remain in theory. That's all I had to say, and I'm going to stop now.
Vinayak, you're the very reason why I don't ever attempt to answer questions or even make statements when you are around. So I'm happy that I stopped with questions. In the interest of time, I'm not going to make any further comments. I know you, in any case, you've left with very little questions to be asked further. So I'm going to circle back to Montag to get his views on what Krishnan said about the issue relating to the state autonomy and the state participation as a stakeholder in this entire program. Vinayak has made his observation, but I thought it's very important to listen to you, what you have in mind on that.
Thank you. Can I be heard?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Shesh. Well, first of all, let me say that really an excellent discussion. I've certainly learned more from it than I've contributed. I think both Krishnan and Vinayak have raised some very crucial questions and issues and so on. So let me make some very quick comments. First, on the issue of stakeholders, consultation with the states, I appreciate Vinayak making the point that the policy does contain some incentives for state governments. That's good, I think. But I think the problem that really arises is that, the theory of monetizing existing assets in order to build more assets raises the question that if I'm monetizing an asset in Tamil Nadu in order to build a new one in Andhra Pradesh, would the state government of Tamil Nadu be a little happier if it was being done, if I was monetizing the asset in Tamil Nadu in order to build another asset in Tamil Nadu itself? Now, I'm not saying, I don't want to go too far down this road, but you can imagine a situation where successful assets are usually in the better developed states and the lack of infrastructure in the less developed states. So it is the monetization will occur of the assets in the better developed states and will ultimately be used to generate assets in the less developed states. To some extent, this is perfectly reasonable. But maybe an incentive would be that whenever an asset is monetized, X% of it will be used to create another asset in the same state. That, I think, would slightly improve the degree of stakeholder connection. The second thing really relates to land. I mean, that is the biggest problem. And, you can't separate the state government from the land, because when you're selling these things, the land is actually given for a specific use. I mean, if Hindustan Photo Films is being sold, then the land that it sits on cannot be used for any other purpose without the state government authorizing that to happen. So I think there needs to be clarity whether we are actually freeing up the use of land, because that would be reflected in transparent bidding, or are people just buying the asset in the hope of later on doing a deal with the state government, shutting down the enterprise and capitalizing on the value of the land? I mean, all these hotels, for example, that's the biggest problem, because 3/4 of the hotels that the ITDC owns are sitting on lands which have been given by state governments, or are, if not given, they've been authorized by state governments only for use as hotels. So if the hotel is making no money at all, the assets itself has a huge amount of capital locked in, but that capital can only be realized if it's transparent whether that will be freed. And you know, in the absence of transparency, people always assume that some cronies will buy up the land, buy up the asset, and then hope to do a deal with the state government in order to get the freedom on the land. That's a big, big problem that really needs to be addressed. I completely agree with what Vinayak said, that on the issue of how to take care of PPP problems, the Kelkar report is an excellent report. I mean, I think the first thing that the government should do is to set up a high-level committee to quickly look at the report and decide once for all, I mean, is it accepting it or not accepting it? It would be perfectly okay to say we've considered this report and reject it, because then people will try to build something different from what is put in the report. But completely ignoring a report that was, I think, submitted several years ago, and then getting other guys to start solving the same problem again seems a little wasteful. So I really do think that going back to the Kelkar, I've read the report, and I think we were thinking along these lines. It has done an excellent job of putting together all the accumulated knowledge that there was. I'm still not certain that the proposal to set up some high-level outside committee to do renegotiation, whether that will actually ever fly. Because I think in order to become totally transparent, it will in all probability be staffed by people who will be as resistant to change as a normal civil servant is. But I think if they were given very clear guidelines, it would definitely be an improvement. So I think we should certainly look for that. I think those are the main points that I wanted to comment on. But I agree with what one point, very strongly agree with what Vinayak said. You know, it's true that the appetite at the moment for new investors, whether domestic or foreign, to come into new greenfield infrastructure is virtually zero, simply because the construction risk, the possibility of motivated interventions, interrupting construction, etc., are too high. And therefore, it makes sense for the next 2 or 3 years to concentrate on monetizing the brownfield asset. Now, my feeling is that when we do that, 3 years later, the risk perception will change. Because if you have a lot of projects that are actually being run by private operators successfully, etc., I think the perception that the country is now ready for PPP will change. So I wouldn't rule out new greenfield PPP in any means, but he's right that simply relying on it now without demonstrating that we can do a good job in this area is not very, very productive. And you know, it's I mean, yes, he's right that it's far too ambitious, but that's okay. I mean, look, Manmohan Singh used to say about planning that, you know, a man's reach must exceed his grasp. So the name of the game is not whether they go from 2.5 to 6 lakhs. So if they go from 2.5 to 4.5 lakhs, I mean, some people will say, look, you haven't met your target, but on the other hand, you did a hell of a lot better. So I would not set too rigid the guideline to judge success. I'd just say, look, in the next 3 years, can we increase what was done in the past 5 years by 40%, 50% or so, even if you can't double and treble it? Thank you.
Thank you, Montag. I just want one very, very important point that Vinayak flagged not to go unnoticed, the enormity of the task in terms of scaling up from the 2.5 lakhs to 6.5 lakhs, and talking about funds, the Canadian pension funds and the sovereign funds from UAE as the solution for that has a certain risk. Particularly, I'm realizing this in the last few weeks when I've been in discussion with some sovereign funds on this very matter, that the pricing is going to be significantly higher because of the country and exchange risks embedded in this. And therefore, I'm a little scared to look at the kind of impact that will have on the user charge if the returns have to be met. And therefore, the whole issue of renegotiations popping up pretty quickly if there were to be any crystallization of the risk in any manner going forward. And that circles back to what Viswanathan started with in terms of the experience that Aaluwalia Ignite had, of having to have a liability which was much beyond what was initially contracted for. And that's the kind of scenario that could just unravel. I think in the interest of time, I will stop there. Montag.
Yeah, there's just one point I want to make that, Vinayak is right to have pointed out the importance of these funds wanting to come in. Keep in mind that if these funds come in, let's say they pick up a 4-lane road, they may well become interested in expanding it to a 6-lane road 2 or 3 years down the road. I mean, so what looks like a brownfield, almost all our roads actually have available land, which can in fact be used to expand the road. Their willingness to do such a thing, which would become a new kind of a greenfield project, piggybacking on a brownfield project, would be much greater if they've gained experience with actually implementing it. That is, the operator who's actually implementing it might be willing to do this expansion, and these same guys would be happy to fund the expansion.
Montag, there, I think there is an issue relating to the profile of the investor. Some of the funds that we talked about, named, are typically those who look for safe haven annuities and not venture into greenfield operations. But on the other hand, the profiles of entrepreneurs who can come into this in the hope that they have an ability or an opportunity to build greenfield size on top of the brownfield, that's the kind of profile that we should really be coveting, because they are the people who are going to be creating new assets as well and connecting the dots, which is what I mentioned. But I think this is a discussion for another day. I think I was just going to echo what you said, that personally I've gained a lot more than what I have contributed, several times more. And if that's the feeling that rest of the participants have, then I think, Viswanathan, you've met your objective of getting all this outstanding people coming together. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Mr. Sesh, I think Mr. Nayak Chatterjee, did you want to say something else? I saw you put up your hand. Is there a final quick comment you wanted to make as well before we?
Very quick comment. We tend to think that there are only two models, greenfield and brownfield. Since we are talking colors, let me advance an intermediate model and let me call it bluefield. There is a concept called plug and play, where the government sets up 100% SPV. That SPV acquires the land and gets all the clearances, project and all the permissions, and then sells that SPV to the private sector. So it removes development risk, but still keeps construction risk. So remember, there is an intermediate model called plug and play, which I'm calling bluefield, which would be a very useful intermediate step to move backwards from what we are saying now, from brownfield to greenfield. You can stop at the station called bluefield, which is plug and play. The government has not taken this seriously. The only person who applied this was Mr. Shahi when he was Secretary Energy, when the 4 ultra mega power plants, UMPPs, were offered on a plug and play concept during the UPA time. And that was a very good one. That's all.
Just a couple of points. Just one that, it's interesting that the point was made about the Kelkar committee and having a kind of a common framework on which PPP is done. I just want to reflect on this, that although the Government of India has been thinking about a procurement act and a PPP procurement act for many, many years, it's still not happened. TN is probably one of the few states which has not just a procurement act, but also a PPP set of rules, which are fairly robust and workable. But for various reasons, of course, PPPs haven't taken off at all, but at least we have an operating framework within which, and it's the same set of procedures and processes that across departments we need to follow, and you won't have a lack of uniformity in the way that the process works. And I think that's a very important point that Mr. Chatterjee made, that you need a standard process which everyone understands. And I think that is critical. How you'll evaluate the project, how you'll put together the entire procurement process, and how it works. And again, the capacity point is something that he reiterated. And again, the plug and play is another model which, yes, we do adopt, especially for industrial infrastructure, where you need it for various kinds of industrial parks, and that option is certainly. So let me just thank you.
Right.
Thank you. Over to you, Vish.
I'm actually going to take over
Okay, Bala.
and bring it to a close as well. But on behalf of Mr. Vishwanathan and industrial economists, just wanted to thank you all panelists. As always, learned so much more. And you would think that a topic of asset monetization, privatization, etc., aren't the ones that elicit a lot of fun and pardon my language, sexiness in topic and learning. But seriously, if the last hour and a half or slightly more has been an attestation of why this is such an important and exciting topic. This is also the very reason why Industrial Economist has been organizing these seminars, to bring awareness to important issues, even raise it to the public domain, so it's not in the hands of a select policymaker or a select group behind closed doors, but provoke thoughtful debates and solutions that could be analyzed and crowdsourced as well. We do live in an era of sensationalism, news being cocooned into echo chambers of preferences, and our panelists today have helped understand both content and context in addressing this important subject. So we may not have always had good, stable, easy answers, but we certainly had a lot of the right questions come up. Dr. Aaluwalia, it was truly useful to understand the foundational table setting around how the government typically approaches or has approached infrastructure, the private-public partnership or captives, as they sometimes feel, according to you, GDP growth targets, and so on. And in the absence of the planning process, it was good to hear from you the thoughts on how the infra focus and investment approaches have shifted. And the key takeaway for me was the selling of family silver to buy better and newer silver as well. So that was really interesting. Mr. Krishnan, you've always been an expert in the art and science of navigating politics with both business, economics, and social concerns. What was truly amazing is your ability to connect the Nizam of Hyderabad, Tipu Sultan, British colonialism, and asset monetization, which typically I wouldn't have expected, but thank you for doing that. And personally, as you know, I could relate to your leadership around building the health infrastructure in Tamil Nadu. You know what I'm talking about, and your continued championing of focusing on health, both in the public and private sectors. Mr. Chatterjee truly got educated on the modernization and explaining the three forces of work. Everything from development and construction risk being more nebulous for a lot of people, and understanding the class of global funds in how they support our base in infrastructure projects. We also appreciate your direct addressing of the federal and state understanding around PSU divestments and the concerns that we are only meeting about a third of the 7.5 lakh crores per annum to mobilize private capital and needing to do much better at that. Your passionate advocacy for needing a centralized knowledge repository around PPP approaches shown through, and we're hoping that you and the others will help see that through as well. Final few seconds, just wanted to thank a couple of other people, our partners CII, who have helped orchestrate this event from a technology and a marketing perspective. So sincere thanks to them. Meenakshi, always ready and willing to help moderate and coordinate this. So my specific thanks to you. And finally, panelists, I'm sorry, participants and delegates. You are the customers and the reasons why we host many of these. Thank you for your participation, staying for a few extra minutes and pace. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.